West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théères, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire.
The House January 6th committee released a trove of new information today, a new batch of deposition transcripts, including unreleased testimony from former White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson and former White House aide John McEntee, who testified that Donald Trump wanted a blanket pardon for everyone involved on January 6th. Trump floated the idea, and former White House counsel Pat Cipollone said no. The transcripts add to the 845-page report released by the committee Friday detailing the extent of Trump's plot to overturn the election, alleging that Trump or his inner circle engaged in at least 200 apparent acts of public or private outreach, pressure, or condemnation, targeting state officials to overturn election results. That includes 68 meetings, phone calls, or texts aimed at state or local officials, 18 public remarks targeting them, and 125 social media posts. The report also provided damning evidence about Trump's state of mind during the attack. According to the report, as the violence was underway, a Trump aide, Robert Gabriel, texted someone, "POTUS, I'm sure, is loving this." The decision whether or not to pursue criminal charges against Trump now lies with the Justice Department, but the committee made recommendations on how to prevent another January 6th from happening, notably urging congressional committees to examine a formal mechanism to evaluate barring Trump and others mentioned in the report from holding future office under the 14th Amendment. Joining me now, Charles Coleman, civil rights attorney, MSNBC legal analyst, and host of the Charles Coleman podcast, and Tim O'Brien, senior executive editor at Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC political analyst. Thank you both very much for coming to the readout. Tim, I think it's interesting that we saw reporting in real time, but now we have it in the report, a blanket pardon. Trump wanted a blanket pardon for people who were involved on January 6th. You are an attorney. You know that. You hear that. It's in an official government report. What do you think that does over at DOJ?
Well, people don't seek pardons unless they think they've committed a crime. And if the President of the United States is seeking a pardon for several to a multitude of people in his own administration, it suggests that he was worried he committed a crime, or the people around him may have committed a crime, or the people around him may be able to testify against him in a court of law. It's also interesting that his own attorneys advised him not to do this, because I think it suggests guilt. Mm-hmm. I don't think it should surprise anybody that Trump sought to do that. I don't think it should surprise anybody that people in his own administration were looking for a pardon as the clock was ticking out on his tenure in the White House. But of course, the American public should worry about it, because as the January 6th report showed, the January 6th event wasn't a single day event. It was premeditated. There was planning for it that began months before that date. There were activities that continued after that date, and it was a criminal conspiracy. And I think the act of seeking a pardon is just another indication of possible guilt.
And Charles, I would love to get your view on that. But also in the transcripts, we have transcripts from a bunch of people, not just Cassidy Hutchinson, but Ali Alexander, the Stop the Steal organizer, Brad Raffensperger, Eugene Scalia, who at the time was Labor Secretary, and also Steve Mnuchin, who was Treasury Secretary. And in his transcript, he notes that they briefly discussed the 25th Amendment. And so you see there. So again, my conversations with Secretary Pompeo, it came up very briefly in our conversation. We both believed that the best outcome was a normal transition of power, which was working. And neither one of us contemplated in any serious format the 25th Amendment. We should point out that in Secretary Scalia's transcript, he denied conversations about the 25th Amendment. But you put all... I would love your legal analysis of both this conversation, whether it was serious or not, about the 25th Amendment, on top of Trump saying, hey, blanket pardons for everybody.
Well, Jonathan, I think that there are two different ways to look at this. And Tim hit the nail right on the head with his remarks about the fact that a large part of what we are seeing here is a person who is embattled with the truth, does not want to face it, and is insistent upon using every means at his disposal to go about exploiting different parts of our Constitution and different parts of the law, albeit illegally, to try to maintain power. And I think that on a certain level, there's the shock and the awe that's associated with that. But legally, when you get into what the actual report says, you start to see how well coordinated an effort that this was and how widespread a campaign that it was, and that it was extremely intentional, and that there cannot be any question about the outcome that it was intended and engineered to affect. And so all of these things put together, particularly when you start talking about the 25th Amendment, whether serious or not, these are relatively obscure pieces of the U.S. Constitution that most people don't even know about, let alone openly discuss. And the fact that there may have been a discussion, to me, signifies and indicates that there was a clear intention to try to find a loophole, try to find an avenue, a crack, a window, something that was going to allow Donald Trump to hold on to power, which he was not lawfully entitled to.
Charles, let me get you on one more thing, and that was Trump's state of mind. And as I read before, Robert Gabriel, a Trump aide, texted to someone else, POTUS, I'm sure, is loving this. What does his state of mind, how does that play in, say, what DOJ could be considering in its own investigations into January 6th and Trump's role?
Well, looking at it as a former prosecutor, Jonathan, what I will say is that anything that you can do to bring in the notion of state of mind, you're going to bolster the question of intent. And in this case, if Donald Trump were to ever be tried, prosecuted, and this were to be litigated in court, one of the key elements that's going to be necessary for the government to prove is establishing the actual intent that Donald Trump had in affecting the outcome, which ultimately resulted. And so things like this, testimony like this, while another person is not going to actually be able to testify as to another person's frame of mind or what it is that they thought or intended at the time, what you can do is put this all together in a way that tries to paint a picture to a jury, to a judge, to a court that says, listen, this guy was fully aware of what it was that he was doing. He continued to do it. He had opportunities to stop it, and he didn't because he had the requisite intent necessary to commit the crimes for which he is being prosecuted for. Mm-hmm. And that's how you use that as a prosecutor, and ultimately its value and its weight that Jack Smith is going to be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Tim, NBC News is reporting that Trump's tax returns are going to be released to the public on Friday. This is coming from the House Ways and Means Committee. And we already know from the New York Times that Trump paid $1.1 million in taxes during his presidency, but zero in 2020. I'm just trying to understand, what recourse does the public have finding out that a former president of the United States not only paid zero taxes in 2020, but we also know that the IRS didn't fulfill its legal obligation to audit his taxes when he was president.
Yeah, it left you a little speechless because you pay your taxes, don't you? And so it's strange when a self-proclaimed billionaire decides that he doesn't have to pay any. And now that we have the documentation, we know that in some years he paid none. while he was proclaiming to stand up for average Americans who have to pay a big chunk of their own income in taxes. I think what we know so far about the tax returns, there's a massive institutional failure at the IRS. There is supposed to be a mandatory audit of presidents. It occurred during the Obama administration, and Biden has already been subjected to it, but somehow magically Donald Trump was not audited, even though he has a more complex financial picture and arguably more income than either one of those men. So why didn't it happen? It's either because the IRS is inept or it's because the IRS was in the tank. Either answer is not a good answer. So the IRS needs to be scrutinized for dropping the ball on this. More broadly, I think the larger problem we have with Donald Trump's tax returns are not simply the last 6 years of his tax returns, it's the last 30 years of his tax returns. We don't have a good picture on the kind of foreign or domestic financial influence that came to bear on him before, during, and even now, before and during his presidency, and even now. And this is not a partisan issue. If we believe in good government, whether a president is a Democrat or Republican, they should be financially transparent so we know that they are not conflicted when they're making public policy. And we still don't have enough years of returns from Donald Trump to get a full sense of that. And it remains a national security issue, and it remains an issue around good government. And I think this release should be the first chapter. It shouldn't be the last step.
It is Wednesday, the 28th of December of 2022, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef, and our daily special is Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. Will no one rid us of these meddlesome priests? And I'm not referring to the former Pope, the Polish Pope. Nah, he's apparently not doing too well. But, well, not my favorite Pope. But hey, when you're an emissary of God, who are we to question it? In fact, that's the whole point, right? Right? Well, enough of that. We want to apologize for acts of God yesterday, beyond our control, and had nothing to do with our ISP. When something goes wrong with the feed and it's the ISP, that is normally now an act of God, because who can question them? Anyway, it was actual nature involved, and it impacted a lot of the state. We have a news story in the read today about that, so I won't go into it too much. But I will say that here at the property the mothership resides, those were pretty strong winds. We've been here for several years now, more than several, and that is anecdotally, because it was just me talking about it, that was the strongest wind that I've seen come through here. And testament to that is that it knocked over things and destroyed things that we have had really strong winds before that did not damage those items. And there was a lot blown over. Oh man, when the power went out, of course, we had power outage yesterday, as you know as well, over much of this part of the state. And we were a part of that. And it was around 4:30ish or so, and I went outside just to check things out, and the winds had started to blow. I had mentioned before that we were under an active wind advisory, which we are again. And I had poo-pooed it and said, but in our protected valley, we usually don't get the really strong winds. Well, if those weren't the really strong winds, I would have hated to have been where they were. And once again, I'll get more into it during the news read. But here, it blew over a gazebo that I had out in the middle of the yard that was quite nice. And fortunately, I was able to salvage it. I only had a couple of broken pieces that are pretty integral to be able to make it into a gazebo again. But it comes in sections, and I think that I might be able to replace a few of those fixtures to be able to get them to snap in. So we'll see. It obviously needs a new awning. The very top part It's one of those like multi-layered type gazebos where there's a ventilation tent at the top, we'll say. That came out okay, so I got that at least. But anyway, I was able to collapse it all back down and get all the parts together and pretty much in order, so it's not so difficult to reassemble, except I still need these connecting parts that the wind had broken on the little spot weld. You know, no one, it's a combination of bad welds and bad metal. Man, I just wish U.S. Steel was working again. But yeah, it broke along one part that is, yeah, I need the new part. So hopefully I can replace that. Blew over some statuary. They didn't break, fortunately. But that's never happened before. Blew over statuary, my God. I have a big gazebo out on a cement pad, quite large, and weighted down, too. I've got planter buckets, little pails that I have sand in, and then on top of that, some dirt and flowers and plant material, but quite heavy. And it had blown and slid quite a bit on the pad. Greenhouse was already in disrepair. I need to replace it, but it stayed in place. It was a little bit more protected and tied down. Though that wouldn't have mattered because the gazebo out in the yard was weighted down, pinned to the ground, and it just pulled those pins right out. Oh, well, should have used a corkscrew kind, but how do I get those in? We'll see. Anyway, enough of that. We'll, as I mentioned many times already, we'll get into that weather report even before the weather, because it's part of the actual news. It was quite an experience. Okay, so let's see. Donald Trump is still going even more crazy about his, looks like an even more possibility of actually being indicted. Greg Abbott continues to get fallout for his cruel behavior in dumping babies. I'm serious. Babies in arms, toddlers, moms and dads, in front of Kamala Harris's house in D.C. And she wasn't there, of course. But 18-degree weather. I would, as a neighbor, I'd be pretty mad if 4 or 5 buses parked outside on the street where I was trying to have, a Christmas Eve gathering with family. And these buses are idling out in front of my house in the middle of the night. 18-degree weather. But I think that's the whole point, isn't it? Because I'll tell you, if there was some sort of action that I don't know why I'm making it such a partisan issue, but why not? They started it, did they? Yeah, they did. What if we did some kind of, I don't know, we take busloads of something in the middle of the night in front of Greg Abbott's house. First of all, he's in a gated community, and I think he's got like Texas Rangers ringed around his property. No one can come within 20 miles of it before, I don't know, being taken care of. But say that we could do that. I don't think he would like it. It would never happen because, as I said, no one's going to get close to Greg Abbott's house. Because they know. They know that what they're doing is abjectly wrong. Goes against everything that they purport to be as Christians. But the cruelty is the point. And then but I have to say, they have the audacity to call themselves Christian. My God. And I mean that literally. My God. When I was raised as a Catholic, and I got to tell you, my immediate family, they weren't Catholics. My grandmother was a devout Catholic. My immediate household, they were, not so Catholic. And in time, obviously, quite agnostic, we'll say. Others might say libertine. Whoa! But anyway, When I say raised as a Catholic, my grandmother had a lot to do with that. And I loved her because she was a great gal, very educated, erudite. Oh, my gosh. But I had a rather rigorous Catholic education. We'll say it that way, because you go home and then you get a little bit of questioning about what is religion, after all, except a way to suppress the masses. Yeah. Anyway, now in this rigorous, and I got to say it was rather rigorous, Catholic education, one thing that the nuns really imparted upon us is that, first of all, you don't ask God for things. You don't ask God like, God's not Santa. I want a new, red fire truck toy. I want some Lincoln Logs. Remember those Lincoln Logs? I love those. I actually love those better than Legos. Okay. But there's the way of things. Anyway, you would not pray for material things to benefit you necessarily. You could pray for the general good, if you wanted to have some sort of materialist vein in your prayer. Now, I don't see that necessarily being taught in some other Christian religious institutions, shall we say. I've experienced a few of them, just checking things out. But that was something that really stayed with me. And so the idea that somebody like a Greg Abbott or a DeSantis would cloak themselves in the guise of Christianity and then behave in such an unchristian way, I don't know. What happens to those types of people? Well, Dante made all these levels of hell to sort of, a wishful thought. This is what might happen to these oligarchs, these arrogant aristocracy types. It was just wishful thinking. Because it doesn't matter. In the end, we're all, food for the worms. Which, by the way, have you been hearing that nematodes and stuff have been, they're going extinct? No, they can't be going extinct, but their numbers apparently have been drastically diminished. Nematodes, we need them. Jeez. Well, we used to say that when the world ends, it won't really end. It'll end for us because we won't be around, but everything else gets to live. And I'm thinking, well, if there's no nematodes, what's left? Okay, I'm serious. Look it up. All right. So Southwest Airlines, what's up with them? Yikes. 2,700 more flights canceled today. 2,800. And that's on top of the, 24 from the day before and 3,000 some odd flights the day before that. Not even speaking about Christmas Day. And they're saying it's because of an antiquated scheduling system for their own staff. Hearing horror stories like one flight attendant was on hold for over 20 hours. Call me back. I'm hanging up, okay? When you get it, here's my number. Give me the automated call. Apparently they don't have the automated call, or it's something weird. 90s technology, which I got to say, here at the mothership, we're using some rather old operating systems. The PC, the Dell, runs on Windows 7, and I've got to upgrade it, I know. I've been able to limp it along, even though it's not being supported as apparently, but it's still working. I have some bits of software that do get updated that will protect me, but we'll see. It's getting rather old. It's getting filled up, so I guess I gotta actually get another machine with a more modern operating system, let alone the broadcaster. We've been able to limp that one along, too. Did get some newer software, not the whole operating system, but there was aspects that were not going to be supported, like Dropbox wasn't going to sync apparently, and I was able to do a fix so that that would occur. But I'm going to have to get a machine for the broadcaster too. But we'll work on that. And thank you to all of you out there who have been helping us be able to do that. You're helping us make a big dent in the bills, and that really helps. So, well, I wouldn't say a big dent, but in relative terms, it is a big dent. All right, I guess we're just rambling here. Yesterday was a wash, and I'll tell you why, once again, is that I had every intention of making a podcast, but there was so much to do around the outside of the property, let alone the general day-to-day care for dear old Ma, that I was just a little too tuckered out to be able to to do a podcast. I actually had the newsread already, but I just didn't have time and energy, shall we say. There was quite a bit to do, so oh yeah. All right. Well, all of that stated, oh my gosh, look at the time. We're just burning it up. What do we have in store for you today here in the Bistro Cafe as we begin on this Smothered Benedict Wednesdays? That White House aide testified Trump wanted blanket pardons for everyone involved in that January 6th insurrection. That one, because that one's still going on as far as I'm concerned. On the rest of the menu, Republicans distorted crime data to win elections, but it didn't work. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration wants to know why Tesla has stopped reporting its Autopilot safety numbers online. Yeah, just one day they decided they're not going to do that anymore. And monster waves, high tides, and gale-force winds that battered Oregon and Washington led to fatal crashes, power outages, and flooded homes. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where about 200 women are still in prison in Mexico under outdated anti-abortion state laws, even though the Supreme Court decriminalized abortion last year. And pre-Christmas weapons inspections in a small town in northern Greece has turned up hand grenades, assault rifles, and decades-old unexploded ordnance. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. Homepage at netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is the chat room link, and the chat room is monitored by Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly. Across the page from that chat room link at our homepage at netrootsradio.com is the link to our Patreon page. And as I intimated before, if you could become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio, it helps us pay our bills and continue the upgrades and just general maintenance and all the machinery that is needed to keep this powerhouse of resistance resisting. And thank you for your generosity. If I'll just mention this real quick, and I know many have heard this before, but I feel like I have to repeat myself. If you could afford an espresso-type coffee drink and send those funds our way once a month, thus becoming a Patreon, it does help us put a dent in those bills, and it really does help us continue the continuous upgrading and maintenance of this machinery that makes Netroots Radio the powerhouse of resistance it is, and we thank you. Thank you. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, I know we still do that here, you can do so at Netroots Radio, and we do have a Mastodon account, and I guess just look for Netroots Radio. the real address. You can find it at the links at my homepage, but I'll get to that in just a moment, or my Daily Co's diary. Anyway, you can follow Netroots Radio on Twitter at Netroots Radio, and we can do so at Mastodon as well. And Tom takes care of those, and we thank Tom for doing so. And as I mentioned, follow me on Twitter at Justice Putnam. That the links to the show notes and links diary can be found on my feed there at Twitter, and of course on Daily Co's, where you find that show notes and links diary. That is where you will be able to link up with the actual articles that I have, shall we say, abbreviated or added to. If you would like to follow the show on Twitter, do so at Cookbook West, and pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, etc., etc., etc. This first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Smothered Benedict Wednesdays is by Matt Cohen out of the American Independent. In the months leading up to the midterm elections in November, Republican campaigns nationwide made claims of rampant crime in cities and states run by Democrats one of their central messages. GOP candidates inaccurately repeated the false claim in advertisements and on the campaign trail that crime is up because of progressive prosecutors and the Democratic Party's support for the defund the police movement, using distorted stats on crime. The tactic did not largely pay off. GOP candidates peddling crime rhetoric underperformed in the midterm elections, losing races they were predicted to win and taking full control of Congress. In New York, failed Republican gubernatorial candidate Lee Zeldin spent much of his campaign blaming Democrats across the state for a spike in shootings and violent crime. There is rising crime on our streets and in our subways, and people who are in charge right now in Albany actually feel like they haven't passed enough pro-criminal laws, Zeldin said in the weeks before the election. Now, Zeldin was not the only one. Top candidates in battleground states such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan used similar attacks, blaming their Democratic opponents for increases in crime. We're done with Whitmer's violent crime wave in the state of Michigan, said Tudor Dixon, the GOP gubernatorial candidate in that state, at a campaign rally with Donald Trump in September. And peddling the crime narrative was expensive. Between September and the election, Republicans spent nearly $50 million, that's $50 million on TV ads across the country, focusing on crime that presented a distorted, grim perception of cities as wastelands of violent crime, according to The Guardian. Sanctuary cities, weak prosecutors, crime skyrocketing, failed liberal policies are making us less safe, said an August National Republican Senatorial Committee TV ad supporting Mehmet Oz, the GOP Senate candidate in Pennsylvania. We call him a carpetbagger. Crazy, dangerous ideas are hurting our communities. We need a change, the campaign summed up. If the violent, harsh portrait of a dystopian America that candidates like Zeldin, Dixon, and Oz described had been accurate, then the election results might have turned out differently. But the attacks by Republican candidates were based on a misrepresentation and distortion of incomplete crime data that does not paint a complete picture of the situation. I always argued, if these cities are full of crime and they were burned down during the Black Lives Movement riots, right? Because I keep getting this thing, like our cities have been burned. They've been burned to the ground. And I keep asking, okay, if that's the case, where are the appropriation bills to rebuild the cities? There aren't any because they're not being rebuilt. They don't need to be rebuilt because they were never burned to the ground. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the facts are. They have their message and they're going to stick to it. While violent crime rate increased in most urban areas between 2021 and 22, a survey conducted by the Major Cities Chiefs Association, a coalition of police executives representing some of the largest cities in the country, shows that the number of homicides slightly fell in that same period, meaning there were fewer killings but more robberies and aggravated assault cases. A study conducted by Third Way, a center-left think tank, found that red states actually have murder rates equal to or higher than those of blue cities. Anecdotally, now, this is just me and my feelings, shall we say? Not so much feelings, but I will say that I have experienced in just this area here in Southern Oregon, since I moved here, in the 7 years or so that I've been back, and I have to admit, I never lived in this part of the state when I was an Oregonian, but this is a very white part of the state. And shall we say a lot of tweakers? So all that stated, I've experienced and read about more crime and murders and violence and just everything across the board here in the 7 years than in the whole 35 years I spent in the Bay Area, and mostly at the Berkeley-Oakland border area. I'm just saying. Remember when they said Oakland was the murder capital of the world? I think that by per capita, there's more here in this part of Southern Oregon. I'm just saying. Or this part of Oregon, which is we call Southern Oregon. Or I like to affectionately call Sundown Towns, Oregon. Now, the Republican attack ads omit a recent major factor in determining crime stats, significant changes in the way that local police departments report their annual crime statistics. Much of the data the Republicans cite comes from the FBI's annual Crime in the Nation report, which did show a rise in homicides in 2021, but the FBI switched to a new crime data reporting system at the beginning of 2021 that drastically changed how local police departments report their data. The new system requires police departments to include new details for reported crimes in their data collection. As a result, the figures in 2021 report are incomplete, and as we reported earlier about this as well, only 63% of the nation's police departments submitted data to the FBI, and even then, much of the data submitted was patchy, with some departments not submitting all the data that they were asked to. The 2021 report, for example, does not include full reporting data from some of the country's biggest police departments, including those in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Ahead of the report's release, the Center for Just Reporting, a nonprofit that promotes better journalistic standards for the public understanding of safety, released a guide for reporters covering crime and criminal justice that explains how the changes in the new reporting system would result in an incomplete picture of crime in the U.S. Some of these differences could drive further confusion and misperceptions about crime trends, wrote Laura Bennett, the center's director and the author of the report. And I would say that was a feature, not a bug, to these Republicans. Now, as we can tell, none of this stopped Republican campaigns from cherry-picking data for their attack ads. In New York, for example, Zeldin's campaign put out a graphic ad that shows footage of shootings and violent assaults captured on security cameras while a voiceover says, "You are looking at actual violent crimes caught on camera in Kathy Hochul's New York, and it is getting much worse." Many clips in the ad were from before Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul took office, and one clip depicted a crime that happened in California, not in New York. The actual crime stats in New York City paint a much different picture than the one Zeldin's campaign pushed. According to the New York Police Department, the number of shootings and homicides decreased by more than 30% in October of 2022 compared to October of 2021. Russ Mitchell of the Los Angeles Times brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Like clockwork, Tesla reported Autopilot safety stats once every quarter, starting in 2018. But last year, those reports ceased. Around the same time, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the nation's top auto safety regulator, began demanding crash reports from automakers that sell so-called advanced driver assistance systems such as Autopilot. It began releasing those numbers in June, and those numbers don't look good for Autopilot. Tesla won't say why it stopped reporting its safety statistics, which measure crash rates per miles driven. The company employs no media relations department. A tweet sent to Elon Musk inviting his comments went unanswered. Tesla critics are happy to speak up about the situation, however. Taylor Ogan, chief executive at fund management firm Snowbull Capital, told a Twitter Spaces event on Thursday last to run through his own interpretation of Tesla safety numbers. He thinks he knows why the company ceased reporting its safety record. He said, because it's gotten a lot worse. Also last Thursday, the NHTSA announced it had added 2 more crashes to the dozens of automated driving Tesla incidents that it is already investigating. One involved 8 vehicles, including a Tesla Model S on the San Francisco Bay Bridge on Thanksgiving Day. Through Friday's close, Tesla stock has lost 65% of its value this year. Ogan, using NHTSA crash numbers, Tesla's previous reports, sales numbers, and other records, concluded that the number of reported Tesla crashes on U.S. roads has grown far faster than Tesla's sales growth. The average monthly growth in new Teslas since the NHTSA issued its standing order was 6%. He figures that while comparable crash stats rose to 21%. The Tesla Autopilot crash numbers are far higher than those of similar driver assistance systems from General Motors and Ford. Tesla has reported 516 crashes from July of 2021 through November of 2022, while Ford reported 7 and GM 2. Now, to be sure, Tesla has far more vehicles equipped with the driver assist systems than the competition, an estimated 1 million, and Ogan said about 10 times as many as Ford. All else being equal, that would imply Tesla ought to have a NHTSA reported crash total of 70 since last summer to be comparable with Ford's rate. Instead, Tesla reported 516 crashes. And Lisa Bowman of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. Monster waves, high tides, and strong winds battering western Oregon and Washington led to fatal crashes, power outages, and flooded homes on Tuesday yesterday. Oregon State Police said multiple people died when their car hit a tree on US 26 east of Cannon Beach. Investigators are determining whether the tree fell on the roadway before the car hit it or if the tree crushed the vehicle when it fell. Another motorist was crushed and killed when a tree fell and struck their vehicle while driving farther east on US 26. More than 50 miles of the highway was shut down because of that crash. Downed trees and high winds from rhododendron to Warm Springs, state transportation officials said. In Washington, high tides, known as king tides, and heavy rains caused water to spill into more than a dozen homes in Seattle's South Park neighborhood. The stormy conditions grip the Pacific Northwest as other parts of the nation are reeling from a ferocious winter storm that killed dozens. 30-foot waves were expected to break along the entire coast on Tuesday, with wave heights possibly topping 40 feet on the north coast. As of Tuesday afternoon, Oregon led the country as the state with the highest number of reported power outages, and the mothership here was one, with more than 160,000 customers affected. And along Oregon's north coast, winds hit 80 miles per hour in the Portland metro area. Wind gusts of 60 miles per hour downed powered lines and felled trees, including near the Portland Art Museum downtown. Compared to other utility companies, Portland General Electric reported the most outages, with more than 115,000 customers affected as of 3 p.m. All right, let us now go to our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. This week, making a splash. You just know that Hollywood financier and producer ranks have a checklist for what to look for when deciding whether or not to back a project. A story that's not too convoluted, family values are nice, tech and violence, and extra credit for hints of spirituality, environmentalism, and lately, politically correct bashing of the military-industrial complex. The new Avatar, The Way of Water, gets checks on all these, plus a big one for production values, which is about the only area where this 3-hour epic really shines. In fact, years of production delays were caused by the development time needed for the new underwater motion capture technology that the film uses. It works, though, especially when added to the rest of the cinematography and CGI. Director James Cameron's first Avatar movie back in 2009 introduced us to Pandora and its blue inhabitants, the Na'vi, who are being assailed by evil Earthers needing to colonize a new planet following the ruination of their own. As you know, if you saw the first one, that didn't work out, but you also knew that the Earthers could return, and now they have. The same Na'vi clan at the center of the narrative of the first are back, this time forced to flee to a coastal area and throw in with the natives there, who were at first reluctant to get involved in the fight, but soon come around, joining in the action mostly in and around, like it says in the title, the water. An A-list of actors, none of whom you'll recognize, of course, do their best with Avatar, The Way of Water, and furthering the elusive and ambitious universe creation that Cameron clearly has in mind for the series. Intellectual goals aside, though, it's a dazzling and immersive ride, even if not much substance is added from the first. This has been Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. Catch up with us at take2moviereview.com and feed us back on our channel on YouTube.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1936. That was the day that at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, 200 workers at the Fisher Body, Ohio Company on the east side of Cleveland sat down on the job. Fisher was located in Cleveland's Collinwood neighborhood. It made bodies for Chevrolet automobiles. The workers were part of the United Auto Workers Union. They wanted the company to reduce their weekly hours. The economic downturn of the Great Depression had hurt manufacturing. The Fisher employees wanted to work less each week to avoid layoffs during those hard times. They also wanted to be paid overtime for holidays and Sunday work. Most importantly, they wanted recognition of their union. They decided to sit down for their rights. Outside, as news of the strike spread, allies of the workers marched outside the plant in picket lines. The sit-down tactic spread to other General Motors facilities. Most famously, the workers in Flint, Michigan began their famous sit-down strike. Back in Collinwood, the men stayed in the plant for more than a month. In mid-February, the Fisher workers finally heard some good news. General Motors had decided to negotiate with the workers in Flint. The next day, a band led joyous workers and their supporters through the streets of Collinwood. They ended at Public Hall in downtown Cleveland. It was there that union members voted for their new contract. The newspaper The Cleveland Plain Dealer reported on the agreement. Word of the strike settlement was received with rejoicing by the whole Collinwood district, where many of the strikers live and where merchants had felt the financial effect of the stoppage of thousands of weekly pay envelopes. Today's Labor History in 2 brought to you in memory of Carol Hillman, a passionate friend of workers and volunteer of the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River in the Rogue River Valley of Southern California on the continental United States of America, where it is currently 38 degrees Fahrenheit. We're a little bit cooler than yesterday, and it's going to be even cooler than yesterday today. We're only supposed to top out around 44 degrees, and that could be true. We are still under an active wind advisory and fairly foggy conditions at the moment. Some sun this morning, maybe, with increasing clouds this afternoon, winds light and variable. Rain showers early tonight will evolve into more steady rain later on. Lows in the upper 30s, winds will be light and variable, and we're expecting over a quarter inch, maybe a half. Then rain showers in the morning tomorrow will evolve into more steady rain in the afternoon, highs in the mid-40s, winds light and variable, and rainfall should be over a quarter inch. Pollen is still rated as none right outside the window here in Rogue River proper. The air quality index for the Rogue River Valley region is in the good range at 33 parts per million, and that daytime UV index is low at level 1. Barometric pressure is holding steady at 30 inches. Visibility is at a half mile, and relative humidity is at 100%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. London is 53 degrees and cloudy. Paris is 52 degrees with rain and a flood advisory. Rome is 60 degrees and fair. Kyiv is 34 and mostly cloudy. Kabul is 36 and cloudy. Hong Kong is 62 degrees and partly cloudy. Tokyo is 42 and clear. Sydney, Australia is 70 degrees and partly cloudy. San Francisco, California is 48 degrees and partly cloudy, and New York, New York is 41 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Fabiola Sanchez of the Associated Press brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. About 200 women are still in prison in Mexico under outdated anti-abortion state laws, even though the Supreme Court decriminalized abortion last year. Some of these women suffered miscarriages and never had an abortion procedure, yet they are still being punished under many state laws that consider abortion to be a form of homicide. The laws even applied to women who haven't had an abortion but who suffered miscarriages. The slow legal process to free women who are still in prison made some progress this month when Aurelia Garcia Crucenio, a 23-year-old indigenous woman who was just released from prison after 3 years for having a miscarriage. But many more women remain in jail for seeking abortions, which is no longer a criminal offense.
Je te donne c'est mon amour pour la vie entière. La promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle. C'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Staff at the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. A series of pre-Christmas weapons inspections in a small town in northern Greece has turned up hand grenades, assault rifles, and decades-old unexploded ordnance, police said yesterday, Tuesday. The inspections occurred over 20 days through December 22nd in Florina, a town of fewer than 18,000 inhabitants in the surrounding area, leading to 14 arrests, mostly on charges of illegal weapons possession. Police said dozens of unlicensed shotguns and handguns were seized, along with 14 assault rifles, 8 grenades, and 8 bayonets, a stun gun, and thousands of rounds of ammunition during searches of private homes and storage areas. Ordnance of various types, about 19.5 pounds of gunpowder, and 2 submachine guns were also discovered. Rural areas in Greece have a high prevalence of licensed gun ownership, primarily for hunting, but there are also illicit gun collections, often preserved as trophies and with little practical use. The Florina region also borders Albania, where an illegal arms trade flourished in the 1990s following the collapse of hardline communist rule and a series of subsequent political upheavals. Police said the inspections were continuing in the region to reduce crime and strengthen citizens' sense of well-being and security. Indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up here tomorrow for Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and we will meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théâtres, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.